Hi everyone. Um, we're back now. So hopefully you maybe had a bit of a break or you could have carried on working. So what we're going to be doing in this session is using this wash drawing as our basis. I'm just going to give my brush a little bit of a clean as I'm talking. So using this wash drawing as a basis, we're going to start dead coloring, which, as I mentioned before, basically just means the sort of fairly flat, bigger blocks of color that you place down as the basis, the foundation of the painting, before rendering much form into it. We are going to be putting a little bit of sort of shifts between halftones and lights, but not as fully developed forms as we're going to be working on next week. And certainly no details the sort of details we'll be putting in the final session. So when you start dead coloring, you obviously have to start somewhere. So you have to pick where you're going to put color. And there are different approaches you can take. But generally, I find what works well is to go for your darkest value and your lightest value. So in my painting, or in my reference, definitely the darkest portions are the poor parts of the background that are sort of have a shadow cast over them. They're pretty much sort of pure black right up to the edge of the skull. Some little notes within the skull. Behind the leaves, there are some pure black sections. So that's my darkest value in the painting. The background generally is quite dark. So if I'm going to go for pure black for my shadow, then I know that the rest of the background is going to be a pretty dark gray. And when I put that in, so that's going to be my starting point, is that dark tone. But not a lot beyond that. So just our background, the darkest point of the background. After doing that, we're going to then place the lightest tones, which is going to be the white on the skull is going to be the lightest part, the lightest value in the painting. So just to do a recap, value is how light or how dark something is within the image. So it's not to do with what the color is. It doesn't matter if it's yellow or green or blue. It's about how light or how dark is it. So in this painting, the lightest in the painting as it is at the moment, the lightest portion is just the gray of the panel. The darkest portion is where I've gone as dark as I can with the burnt umber. But that's sort of the darkest value and that's the lightest value. When we start to use white and black, because we're going to extend our palette now, add more colors into the palette, white is going to be a lot brighter than the background, this sort of average tone that we started with. And black is going to be a lot darker than the burnt umber. So it's going to extend our value range. So we want to get those two extremes in place before we then start putting all the middle values. Because until we know exactly how light the skull is going to go or how dark the background is going to go, it's a lot harder to judge how dark the shadow on the skull needs to be. So we're using these, making sure we have these two extremes in place to then make good judgments about how we block everything else in. So that's going to be our starting point. We're going to be working with the background. And that goes for all of them. So that goes for this skull one that I'm working on. We'll be doing the background first. Definitely this girl and this other skull painting as well. So for the other skull painting, we'll be focusing on getting a background into the background behind the skull where that shadow is cast. So that's just pure black where the shadow is cast. Anywhere else that you can see pure black. So there are some little notes within the flowers that go really dark. Some portions of the clockwork go quite dark inside this flower as well. The ground plane is going to be similar sort of color to the background. There's not too much of a distinction. It's slightly lighter, I would say. And generally with the background, try to go for this gradient where it's a little bit lighter on the right-hand side and then it gets gradually darker. So it's like the light is sort of coming in from the left-hand side, which it is, illuminating the skull from this left-hand side. Then things are turning into shadow going towards the right. But what that means is there's more light hitting the right-hand side. So it's as though there's like a little bit of a shadow on this side and then it's sort of a so that's an important thing compositionally. The little clockwork piece that has these bright yellows does provide some balance compositionally as well. So that's what you'll be focusing on if you're working on this skull piece. Otherwise, you're focusing on where to put your darkest notes. This painting probably, this reference has the fewest dark notes. So it's only really just sort of behind the cast there, that shadow below the sculpture, some of these dark shadows in here. So you'll be putting kind of mostly just that kind of light gradient, but then trying to start to get these shadows painted in and sort of smudgily painted in, which you'll see the approach from this one, which has a slightly simpler shadow pattern. So in terms of brushes, you can swap back to a bigger brush. I would actually probably go for pretty much the biggest brush that we can, just because it saves time. So this is in the set that I'm using. This is the largest one, so it's about that much bigger than the one that we were using before. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of like block in the background with this big brush, but only as far as we're not encroaching into the drawing that we already have in place. When we get to a point where we need to go a little bit finer, we can use these smaller brushes that we already have to hand. So you can just keep using those that you have. In terms of the painting, depending on your weather conditions, so if you're in the UK today, it's fairly dry, so it's pretty warm in my studio, and it's starting to dry off already, this burnt umber, which it wouldn't normally, like if this is in winter that you're working on it, if you're watching a recording, it's not going to dry that quickly, but you could allow it to dry. So if you're working on this in your own time, as I say, this could be a separating point. So the point at which you finish your wash drawing before you dead color, you can leave this to totally dry, which is often what I would do, unless I'm kind of pressed for time. Otherwise I might kind of jump straight into the dead coloring, as we are today. So let's pop some more paint onto the palette. So we're going to need some white paint. Reasonable amount of it, because we're painting in the background. Just going to see if my exposure needs to adjust slightly. It might be a little bit overexposed, I think. Yeah, it seems okay. And just autofocus it as well, check it's crisp. Just lock the exposure. So I've got my white paint up, and I need some ivory black. Generally, and you don't have to do this, this is the sort of the layout I follow in terms of placement of paints on a palette. So I start with my white. I pretty much always put it sort of on the right hand side, or the top right is sort of where I always place it. And then on the left, sort of if you're holding the palette normally, on the left, the black would be at the opposite end. So I kind of put them opposite each other. Next to the black, we'll be putting the blue. I won't put that out just yet. So then the two blues are together. Then I usually go for reds, so burnt umber and cad red, and then yellow ochre and cad yellow up to the white, which just generally follows sort of a value arrangement, because the yellows are a bit lighter than the reds. The reds are slightly darker than the yellows locally, and then the ultramarine, the Prussian blues are very dark, and then obviously the black's the darkest. So that's just one way of laying it out. You can put it in any order, but you will find that certain kind of layouts will be a bit easier to work from, a bit easier to mix from. And this palette is designed to function in a particular way. So all palettes are designed to work in their own specific ways. So pretty much all artists will have different preferences for palettes, preferences for colors and color mixtures. And that's something that you develop over time as you work. And it's quite personal as well. So colors are quite a personal aspect. Well, I think of color as quite a personal aspect of painting, even even quite representational painting like this, color can be a lot more subjective, your choices of colors. Whereas value tends to be a bit more absolute, whether something is light or dark has a bigger impact on how the form feels. So for now, I've got my ivory black and titanium white out. I'm just going to give my painting a little bit of a white, my palette, I should say, not my painting. Try not to wipe my painting off at this stage. So yeah, I'll just wipe off most of that burnt umber. You don't have to get all of it because there's not that much of it there anyway. Just to clean the palette slightly. It's more important in later stages to keep the palette super neat when you're trying to mix really specific colors. Things can merge a little bit at this stage. So I want to start. You can work both ways. You could go straight for the shadows. But I have a preference when painting backgrounds, and I find it useful to paint the background first, just because everything, when you're working with something where the objects are definitely separate from the background, like they sit on top of the background, it's kind of nice to paint the background in and then have everything hover. It just increases the sense of trompe-l'oeil, the sort of illusion that things are hovering off a surface. So I'm going to paint my background in first, and I'm going to start with the lighter portion of the background. So in my mind, the background is sort of divided between the black that is the cast shadow, the shadow that's sort of darker shadows that cast onto the background. So you can see it really definitively on these two. You can see it pretty strongly on this one as well, as that strong shadow cast behind the skull. The rest of the background is a lighter gray value. And for both of these, for all of these, I would go for just my background mixture being just white and black. You'll get a kind of slightly coolish gray. It's just a really nice, effective background color that's very simple to remix. If you mix a background color that's got a lot of different pigments in it, when you're overpainting or repainting and you want to match that color, you have to remember all the specific mixtures, which you can do, but I find it doesn't usually add enough sort of, for these sorts of paintings, it doesn't add enough to make it worth the extra hassle. So I would just go for a straight mixture of white and black for my background. It's going to be a dark gray, which is going to be, for this one, just slightly lighter and grayer right up the top left here, and then getting just gradually darker as it goes down. So there's going to be more white mixed in here, just a tad more white mixed in, and then gradually as it goes down, it's going to get darker. And I'm going to leave these portions that I've already kind of noted out as being where the pure black is going to go. So where there's a shadow in the background, where the burnt umber is, that I'm going to paint over with black, and then we'll blend it together. But as I work, you'll get an idea for what we're doing. And as I say, when you get to the sort of edges of these leaves, you don't actually have to go in and paint them just yet. You can leave them for now for this dead coloring stage, and we can go in and do all the tiny bits of background that show through next week. Probably it's not vital to get it in now. We'll see how much time we have, but it's not a priority over the general blocking of all the colors. So I'm going to start by taking some ivory black and just taking just a touch of white. White has quite a high tinting strength. Both white and black do, but white particularly so. So you won't need a lot of white to lighten the black off. So that seems like a nice value to me. So get the paintbrush nice and loaded. Pop that in up here. Yeah, that looks all right. So you can see it's quite cool. It plays quite nicely, I think, against the warmer sort of tones of the shadows from the burnt umber. So in terms of how you structure colors, it works well, I think. And you can see that big brush just allows us to get some nice big confident brush strokes. You don't necessarily have to be super neat at this stage, because we may end up, as a preference, you could go for a slightly washier look to the background. And then you're just kind of using, it's almost paint by numbers at this stage, because you're just filling in the background. You want about the right balance of medium. So it's not too washy, but not so thick that it's hard to lay. So that's maybe slightly washy. So I'm just going to mix the same value. So mix the same proportion of white and black together, but just a little bit less medium. And I can just paint that into what I already have in place, just to load a bit more paint onto the surface. It's not too bad if your brushwork is slightly washy. It adds a nice kind of vibration to the piece, I think. But yeah, we're just going to go through. And as much as possible, use this big brush to create these shapes. The bigger the brush you use, typically the more sort of confident you can get the brushwork to feel. Because you're just sort of forced into using bigger strokes. But if you're struggling, swap back to one of the smaller brushes. If you want to just kind of like make sure you're accurate with bits that maybe need to be a little bit more precise. But where possible, stick with the bigger brush. So for this particular value that I've mixed up, we're working our way, as I say, diagonally down from top left to bottom right. In terms of sort of like where we're going to shift to a slightly darker tone, sometimes something that's useful, you can just sort of plot in, well, at about that point, I'm going to mix a slightly darker value. About that point, I'm going to mix a slightly darker value again about this point, and so on. So, this is sort of this is 1, that's 2, 3, and then this is going to be your 4th and your 5th. So you're going to have about five transitions through the background, working from just slightly lighter, just gradually darker as it goes down. And that very slight gradient will just sort of help the suggestion of the fall of light, the way light's falling across your painting. As I say, if you're working from this one, the fall of light is more sort of just above and to the right, sort of that line down here. And then if you're working here, it's a little bit different, but we're going to look for a fall of light that works from right to left. So it's slightly lighter on that side, and then the left-hand side is darker. So you want to kind of have that in mind before you start painting the background in, just to give it a little bit of structure. So I'm almost at the end of this. Oh, sorry, I'll go a little bit further. This one. And as I say, I don't have to go too deep into where the leaves are for this stage. Go back up here. So I'm going to leave a little bit of space for where this little branch sticks up. Can just leave that as the washed burnt umber for now is fine. And then also a bit of space for the shadow that's cast. That's going to go black, that shadow in there, when we get to that. There'll be a little bit of blending going into it. And same up here. just slightly ran out of the right amount of paint there. Just want to load it a little bit more, just to keep the opaqueness about right. So that's it for that first color. So now all I need to do is just start to mix up maybe a little bit more paint, just to keep a reasonable amount in your mixture. When it starts to get thin, it's just a bit tedious. So mix a little bit more paint, but going just for a slightly darker value. So I think what I've mixed up looks like it's probably too light. I've actually gone lighter. So I'm just going to add a little bit more black. Mix that into it. I'm going to have to put some more black out onto my palette as well. Maybe a little bit more medium too. Just mix that all, get it nice and even. Pop a bit out. Yeah, and that's just a slightly lighter value, so that's ideal. So you can sort of paint it right up to that seam. We're going to be merging them in a moment. So I just realized I've missed a leaf there. If that happens, don't worry too much. We can paint the leaves over the grey background in a later stage. So yeah, I really want to emphasize how much things can be sort of adjusted with oil paint. Nothing's set in stone. So jump back up here, and I can just work to those rough lines, the guide I gave myself again. And then at this point, I would just kind of create a little bit of a blending, so sort of merge those, just kind of work back and forth between them along that edge. So that's going to lighten slightly the darker tone and darken the lighter tone. Just creates a little bit of a gradient. So to that mix, still got a reasonable amount of paint, so I can just add a little bit of black to it, get it darker again. Plonk that. So I'm going to go back up and use the same color up here. Again, using that line that we've got as my guide, and then use a little strip down to the shadow there. And then I need to mix up well, I can actually, we'll do a little bit of blending again. So I'm going to blend up into there, just make sure that transition is working. And up here. It's all right. So then a bit more black, maybe a little bit more white as well, because we just want to mix a bit more paint up this final little passage. So that's just this last edge we're blocking in now. You can see how dark, yeah, it's a little bit darker. Let's get that all washed in and now blended. And then just a tiny, tiny little notch of a slightly darker value here in the corner is required. So down to that edge, and then we can just blend that up. So there you can sort of just see, we've got this gradient that's just falling gradually down the surface. If there's any way you need to kind of make tweaks, so I feel like up here it's maybe just gone a little bit too dark, you can just mix up a little bit of paint. This is why it's useful to have such a simple mixture, because it's easy to make new, slightly adjusted value paints. But yeah, just to look over and see if you feel like the average tone is working well. And that gradient is functioning. And as soon as you've done that, what you can do is, I would take your, say the medium-sized brush. So this is the larger brush. Take a medium-sized brush, same type, that slightly more bristly brush. You're going to need probably a little bit more black paint squeezed out, supposing you you don't have any left. And what we're going to do is we're going to start washing the really dark tones of the shadow over this darker background and then blend them. So where you've got dark sort of shadows on the background, you know it's the background, that's going to be somewhere that we put pure black. So a very obvious place, and you want to put your pure black sort of to the side of your gray on your palette, just so they don't blend, because you want to try to keep the black as dark as possible. I probably won't go absolutely pure black. That's okay, because we're going to be sort of glazing a bit over it next week when we're working more on the forms. The important thing is you just get a good amount of it anywhere where the painting goes that dark. So anywhere you've got a much darker tone, sort of a black tone, you can get this in now. So then back up here, there's certainly some darker notes that are black in amongst the leaves. As I say, you don't have to go too overboard with your all your detailed shapes within the leaves. We'll be revisiting that next session, and we're also going to be primarily just blocking in some general green tones over the leaves anyway. But anywhere there's a sort of major kind of definite dark tone or black tone, we want to get that in. So that's pretty good in terms of, just a little bit here actually, I just realized I'm missing. I'm just going to adjust my exposure again actually. Probably about there, it's not too bad. So this is now starting to look pretty light, this gray tone. So why my exposure went actually was because before the average tone it was trying to expose to was the gray of the panel, but now that I've got these much darker tones in the exposures, it still seems a bit too overexposed actually. So take exposure lock off. Just give me a moment. Just want to make sure that you you don't end up overexposed because it's not ideal. I need white paper actually. Yeah, probably about there's the best we're going to get. Yeah, so it's sort of adjusted to the fact that these much darker tones are in place now. So what I want you to do is, now that you've got the darker tones, your background in place, I want you to start blending. So using that same brush, you can just basically smudge the lines. So they start to blend together. It doesn't have to be super neat. I mean, inherently blending is not a is not something that needs to be crisp, obviously. Just realized I was missing a little bit of a shadow out here. So just using these bigger brushes just to kind of shift around these values. You can add a bit of dark, so you can add some sort of black to your grays if you need to darken them. But primarily we're just sort of starting to blend in a bit, create these softer transitions. And generally, if a shadow is sort of further away, or the shadow becomes further away from the object that's casting it, tends to go softer. So you see that in this one, for instance, the branches are kind of moving away from the backgrounds. They sort of smudge out a bit as they go further up, and then they're crisper nearer where they're first cast, where the shadows first. So down here, for instance, the shadow's crisper, but up here it sort of fades off a bit. And that starts to give a sense that the object is sort of sitting off the surface of the image. So that's why these shadows are quite important to work on. But they're fluid. It's sort of a fluid thing that you're working with. It's very much sort of pure painting that we're doing here. It's all mass based. Not line based. So it's not too bad on that side for these. And as I say, we'll be able to go over this in later sessions as well. But try to go for like the best sort of finish you possibly can at this stage though. And particularly for the that painting that has the little girl's face, there's some really nice subtle shadows in that one. So you can keep blending this just as much as you like. The more you kind of add in between values, the more you can create a better gradient between the transition. Because obviously you're starting with a kind of abrupt transition and you have to paint into it to soften it. But something like that's pretty good. We'll definitely be going back over it in the later stages. So we've got our background blocked in now. I'm just going to leave you guys to keep working on that just while I check in with my full pass student. But yeah, you basically just want to keep working in background. If you got it to this stage already, just sort of fiddle with the transitions, start to make them a bit more complex. The more complex you get them, the more sort of the subtle transitions that you get, or the smaller shapes at this stage in the background, the less work you'll have to do later. So I'll be back in a moment.